The morning arrived like every other morning had for the past 37 years that Henry Cavanaugh had lived in Riverside Hills. The sun rose over the identical pitched roofs at exactly 6:43 a.m. The birds sang their approved-by-nature songs. The grass on his lawn, kept to exactly 2¾ inches by his landscaper, per HOA code, gleamed with morning dew. Henry stood at his kitchen window with his third cup of coffee, watching the perfection unfold outside. He was 74 years old, and he had spent more than half his life in this neighborhood, half a life in perfection. The coffee tasted like every cup he'd ever drunk in this kitchen, medium roast, 1 sugar, a splash of cream. Not too hot, not too cold. Goldilocks coffee in a Goldilocks life. His daughter, Margaret, had called last night from Portland. She'd heard something concerning from his last doctor's appointment. She'd made him promise to be more mindful of his health. She'd used that exact phrase, as if Henry had become a person who needed to be mindful of things, as if he were an experiment that might fail if not properly monitored. "Dad," she'd said, her voice carrying that particular blend of concern and exhaustion that Margaret had perfected over her 46 years. "The doctor said your stress levels are through the roof. What are you even stressed about? You have it all figured out." Henry hadn't corrected her. He hadn't told her that perfection, when maintained long enough, becomes a prison. That knowing every variable, every outcome, every approved shade of exterior paint, Benjamin Moore Ashwood Pearl, code 2022-30B, was less like being organized and more like being petrified. He set down his coffee cup on the granite countertop. It made no sound. Everything in this house was designed to make no sound. The plumbing was sound-dampened. The air conditioning whispered rather than roared. Even his slippers were soft-soled, leaving no track marks on the travertine tile. His phone buzzed. It was 7 a.m. exactly. His morning walk alert. He checked it off his calendar. Every morning, 7 a.m. to 7:35 a.m., Henry Cavanaugh walked exactly 1.3 miles through Riverside Hills. He grabbed his walking shoes, New Balance 990 V3, white with gray accents in pristine condition, and headed out into the neighborhood. The street was beginning to stir. Across the way, Todd Hermitage was backing his Mercedes out of his triple-wide garage. 2 houses down, the Patel's teenage daughter was leaving for school in her sensible Honda Civic. Every action appeared random, but Henry knew the schedule. He knew them all. Todd always left at 7:05. The Patel's daughter always left at 7:40. The Robertson sprinklers kicked on at 6 p.m. sharp, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, per HOA regulations. He walked past the Hendersons' house where the lawn had brown patches last month. There had been an incident. Mrs. Henderson had attempted to use a drought-resistant landscaping package. The HOA had visited. Now the brown patches were covered with sod. Problem solved. Perfection restored. As Henry rounded the corner toward Maple Street, he felt something catch in his chest. Not pain, exactly, more like a skipped heartbeat, a glitch in the system. He kept walking, maintaining his pace. 7 kilometers per hour, the doctor had recommended. He was doing 6.8. His breathing felt tight. The morning was August 15, 2024. Temperature 78 degrees Fahrenheit, humidity at 60%. Perfect weather for a walk. Henry had checked the forecast when he woke up. He always checked the forecast. Weather was one of the few variables in life that still surprised him. He turned down Birch Lane, where the houses became even more uniform, if such a thing were possible. 4-bedroom colonials with 2-car garages and professionally maintained front landscaping. The Riverside Hills Development Association maintained standards that had been refined over decades. Every shutter hinge was inspected quarterly. Every roof was reshingled in the approved colors. The subdivision was so perfect it looked computer-generated. At the end of Birch Lane sat a house that disrupted the pattern ever so slightly. It was still a 4-bedroom colonial, still maintained the required setbacks, still featured Benjamin Moore Ashwood Pearl exterior walls. But something about it felt different. The grass was perhaps a centimeter too tall. The flower beds seemed to have been planted with slightly more enthusiasm than strictly necessary. This was where Marcus and Alina Rothschild lived. They'd moved in 4 years ago, and they were kind people, too kind. The sort of people who brought casseroles to neighborhood gatherings and asked questions like, "How are you really doing, Henry?" and meant the answer. The Riverside Hills didn't know what to do with that sort of kindness. The Riverside Hills preferred politeness, which was the opposite of kindness and far more manageable. Henry passed their house quickly, maintaining his pace, his breathing now slightly more labored. He didn't look toward the front door, though he heard Alina watering her garden. She would wave. She always waved, and he would nod back, maintaining the precise social distance that was appropriate for acquaintances in a suburban neighborhood. As he continued his walk, his phone buzzed, not the walk alert this time. It was a notification from the Riverside Hills HOA mobile app. He opened it. Resident alert, 847 Birch Lane violation report. Date of observation, August 15, 2024, 7:04 a.m. Issue: grass height exceeds maximum allowable variance of 3 inches. Measured height, 3.2 inches. Corrective action required. Remediation within 48 hours or violation fee of $250 will be applied. Reported by HOA Compliance Officer James Hutchins. Henry's breathing did something strange just then. It caught, then released in a long, slow exhale. He stood still for a moment on the sidewalk, watching the notification, measuring Alina Rothschild's lawn to 3.2 inches, charging her money for 0.2 inches of grass. For 17 years, Henry had been the HOA president. He had written many of these violation notices. He had attended many late-night meetings where residents debated the precise shade of approved exterior paint. He had implemented the pool code. Pools were allowed in Riverside Hills, but only if they were maintained to specific chemical standards and covered during winter months and bordered by fencing that was exactly 4 feet tall, not 311 or 41, but exactly 4 feet. He had been good at it. He had been excellent at it. He had kept Riverside Hills perfect. Last month he'd stepped down, not because he was tired, not because he wanted to retire, but because his daughter had called and said, "Dad, when was the last time you did something just because you wanted to?" And he'd realized he couldn't remember. His phone buzzed again. Another notification, another violation, then another. The app was being very active this morning. Henry scrolled through them. Resident alert, 612 Maple Street violation report. Issue: trash cans visible from street view for more than 1 hour after collection day. Corrective action required. Remediation within 24 hours or violation fee of $150 will be applied. The town of Riverside Hills had 1,214 homes. The HOA employed 4 compliance officers. Together, they issued between 40 and 80 violation notices every single month. 40 to 80 reasons why people weren't doing good enough. Henry finished his walk in silence. He returned home at 7:35 a.m. exactly as scheduled. He drank his 4th cup of coffee. He ate his breakfast, oatmeal with blueberries, 7 a.m., same as always. His schedule was a metronome, and he was the tiny figure dancing to its beat. By evening, Henry was sitting in his living room when his phone rang. It was Patricia Chen, the new HOA president. She was calling to ask him something about the archived pool codes from 2015. A resident had requested an exception, something about a specialized pool treatment system that didn't fit the exact specifications. "What do you think, Henry?" Patricia asked. "Should we grant the exception?" Henry knew the answer. The answer was no. Exceptions created complications. Complications created inconsistency. Inconsistency was what had led to the brown patches at the Hendersons' house. But as he sat in his perfectly maintained living room with his perfectly arranged furniture on his perfectly polished floor, he heard himself say something else. "What would happen if we just said yes?" he asked. Patricia laughed. She thought he was joking. "Then everyone would want exceptions, then we'd have chaos." After they hung up, Henry sat in the darkness of his living room. Through the window, he could see the cul-de-sac beyond. The streetlights illuminated the empty lawns, the empty streets, the empty perfection. He stood up and walked to his computer. He opened his email and began searching through archived messages from his 17 years as HOA president. He was looking for something specific. It took him an hour to find it. The email was from 2007. He'd sent it to Alina Rothschild's father, who had owned the house at 847 Birch Lane before she did. The email stated that the man's daughter, who had been visiting for the summer, had painted a small mural on the interior wall of his pool. The pool was private, not visible from any public thoroughfare. Still, the HOA had requested its removal because pool interiors, per code, should be white or a neutral blue-gray to promote clarity and safety standards. Henry had written that email. He'd felt reasonable writing it. Safety standards were important. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, listening to the sound-dampened silence of his house, and thought about the things he'd never done. The places he'd never gone because they weren't in the schedule. The books he'd never read because they weren't pre-approved. The conversations he'd never had with his neighbors because small talk violated the HOA's implicit understanding of appropriate social distance. He thought about his wife, Susan. They'd been married for 43 years before she died, 5 years ago. He wondered if Susan had felt the same way. He wondered if she'd ever wanted to scream in their perfect house, on their perfect street, in their perfect life. He'd never asked. By morning, Henry had made a decision that his rational mind immediately tried to talk him out of. But his rational mind had been in charge for 74 years, and Henry was tired of listening to it. He called in a favor from an old friend, someone who'd worked in theater design before retiring. He asked if his friend had any connections to theatrical supply companies. By afternoon, his friend had sent him a website. By evening, Henry was placing an order. He ordered paint, gallons and gallons of it, colors his rational mind insisted were inappropriate for a residential pool. Crimson, sapphire, emerald, gold, violet, orange, tangerine, lavender, colors that belonged in a dream or a painting, not in Riverside Hills. The website didn't ask questions. The credit card was processed. The shipping address was confirmed. Henry stood in his kitchen, holding his phone, looking at the confirmation email. His heart was racing. His hands were shaking. He felt, for the first time in perhaps 20 years, like something might happen to him that he hadn't already scheduled. He felt alive. The paint would arrive on Friday. It was now Tuesday. Henry had 4 days to prepare. 4 days before he did something that would violate the most sacred code of Riverside Hills, the code that governed the only place remaining where he had any control, his own backyard. He didn't tell anyone, not Margaret, who would worry, not his friends who would advise against it, certainly not anyone at the HOA. He simply waited. Part 2, the breaking point. The paint arrived on Friday morning at 8:30 a.m. The UPS truck pulled up to Henry's driveway with the deliberation of a funeral procession. His neighbors were already out, Todd backing out for his commute, the Patels' sprinklers running, the Hendersons washing their car in perfect synchronized movements that suggested they'd rehearsed it. Henry signed for the delivery without making eye contact with the UPS driver. The 7 large boxes were hauled inside, each one heavy as guilt, beautiful as heresy. He'd spent the previous 4 days cleaning his pool, draining it completely, scrubbing every inch of the interior with a pressure washer that sang its mechanical song into the still suburban air. The neighbors had noticed. He'd seen James Hutchins, the new compliance officer, slow his car as he passed by. Checking, always checking. But there was no violation in draining a pool. Maintenance was encouraged. Now, with the boxes stacked in his garage, Henry stood before the empty pool basin. It was like looking into a grave. He spent Friday evening reading the paint specifications. The paint was commercial grade, designed for outdoor theatrical sets, weather-resistant and non-toxic. It was expensive. He'd spent just under $6,000. The number had seemed abstract when he was entering it into his computer, less real than it did now, staring at it in his bank statement. Margaret was in Portland. She called their weekly call at 6 p.m., like clockwork. Henry was sitting by his window, looking at his backyard when the phone rang. "Hi, sweetheart," he said, and something in his voice must have registered because Margaret immediately asked if he was okay. "I'm fine," he said, "just thinking." "About what?" "About what happens when you spend so long following someone else's rules that you forget you could write your own." There was a pause. Margaret was good at pauses. She'd learned them from him. "Dad, is this about the doctor? He told me your blood pressure was elevated. Are you having chest pains?" "No," Henry said. "I'm just having thoughts." They talked for another 20 minutes about her job, about her partner, about the weather in Portland. They did not talk about what Henry was planning. He did not have the words yet, and Margaret did not ask the right questions. After they hung up, Henry opened a bottle of wine. He rarely drank. It wasn't against the HOA rules, but it seemed vaguely undisciplined. He drank it anyway, standing at his kitchen window, watching the sunset turn his subdivision into something almost magical, a place where shadows moved slowly across lawns, where the light was beautiful enough to make even Riverside Hills look alive. By the following morning, Saturday, Henry was awake at 5 a.m. He'd barely slept. His mind was vibrating with the strangeness of knowing he was about to break a rule. Not a minor code violation. Not something that could be fixed with a warning, but something deliberate, something public, something that would ripple. He dressed in old clothes, jeans with paint stains from when he'd helped Susan paint their bedroom back in 1987. A gray t-shirt, work gloves. He looked for the first time in decades like a man who was about to do something real. The first bucket of paint was vermilion, a red so deep it seemed to contain sunset and anger, and every moment he'd swallowed silence. He carried it to the pool in both hands, like an offering. The empty pool basin stretched before him, white and sterile and waiting. Henry upended the bucket. The paint poured down the side of the pool like blood, thick and slow, and when it hit the bottom, it spread across the white surface like an accusation. The color was obscene in the morning light. It was wrong. It was perfect. He went back to the garage and grabbed the next bucket. Azure blue, the color of water, the color of sky, the color of everything Riverside Hills had ever prevented him from looking at directly. By 7 a.m., the pool looked like it had been attacked by a rainbow. There was vermilion, azure, and touches of gold where Henry had started experimenting with patterns, letting the paint flow in ways that seemed natural rather than planned. His hands were moving without his brain directing them. His hands were remembering something his mind had forgotten. That creation was not about perfection. It was about intention. At 7:15, he heard the first car brake suddenly on his street. He didn't look. He kept pouring paint. Emerald green now, spreading across a section of the pool like an old forest, like something growing. At 7:30, he heard his neighbor, Todd Hermitage, shout something. Henry wasn't sure what. He was fully focused on the purple paint now, the lavender, watching how it mixed with the previous colors and created new shades in the interplay of pigment. By 8 a.m., Henry's face was covered in sweat and paint splatters. His back ached from bending and pouring. His arms were tired. He had 2 more buckets. That's when the first resident made a direct appearance. Henry, what on earth are you doing?" It was Patricia Chen, the HOA president. She was standing at the fence line between their properties, her jaw working like she was trying to process an optical illusion. Patricia was a woman of approximately Henry's age, though she carried her years more effortlessly. She was wearing her weekend clothes, designer athleisure, Henry observed distantly, and her expression was one of profound confusion. "Morning, Patricia," Henry said calmly, pouring the purple paint in long, methodical sweeps. "Beautiful day." "Henry, your pool. Why is your pool?" Patricia's words were fragmenting, her normal HOA vocabulary suddenly useless in the face of something unprecedented. "It needed color," Henry said. He turned to look at her properly. She had the expression of a woman watching someone burn money in the street. "I realized a while ago that I'd been so busy making sure everyone was following the rules that I'd forgotten why rules existed in the first place. To create order, yes, but also to create a place where people felt safe enough to be themselves. Somewhere along the line, Riverside Hills became a place where you could only be yourself if yourself was exactly like everyone else." Patricia opened her mouth several times without speaking. Finally, she said, "Henry, this is absolutely a violation of the Aesthetic and Property Maintenance Code. Section 4.2, subsection C clearly states that all water features must be maintained in a manner consistent with neighborhood aesthetic standards. You're going to be facing fines. The HOA board is going to have a problem. This is insane." "I know," Henry said. He poured the last bucket. It was a burnt orange that looked like autumn leaves, like dried earth, like time passing and things ending and beginning again. Patricia stood at the fence for another moment, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Then she turned and walked rapidly away, pulling her phone from her pocket. Henry set down the empty bucket and stepped back to look at his pool. It was magnificent. It looked like Jackson Pollock had painted it. It looked like a sunset and a thunderstorm and the color of music. It looked like something a human had made with intention and passion, not something that had been designed by committee to offend no one. It looked nothing like Riverside Hills. For about 12 minutes, Henry was alone with his creation. He stood in his backyard, looking at what he'd done, and felt something in his chest that might have been regret or might have been the complete opposite of regret. It felt like truth. Then his phone started buzzing. The notifications began in the Riverside Hills neighborhood Facebook group. Someone, probably Todd Hermitage, had posted a photo of the pool with the caption, "Cannot believe this is ALLOWED." The comments came in faster and faster. Crazy neighbor 247. Is that even legal? Perfect Patty. This is exactly why we need stricter enforcement. I have a pool too, and if I painted mine like that, I'd be fined immediately. Miketh Muscle, someone call code enforcement. Debbie Downsizer, I kind of like it. The last comment was deleted almost immediately. Patricia had apparently called an emergency meeting of the HOA board. James Hutchins, the compliance officer, was going to visit Henry's property within the hour. There was a legal maximum for violations, and Henry had apparently broken it. Henry went inside and made himself a cup of coffee. Not his usual morning coffee. That moment had passed into the before. Instead, he made it carefully, thinking about the taste he wanted, not the taste he should have. The doorbell rang at 9:15 a.m. James Hutchins was a man in his 50s with the bearing of someone who had dedicated his life to rules. He was wearing his official HOA compliance polo shirt, and his expression suggested he was about to deliver bad news. "Mr. Kavanaugh," he began, and Henry noticed he wasn't using the friendly Henry that they'd used during his tenure as HOA president. "I'm here regarding a violation of multiple sections of the Riverside Hills Covenant, Codes, and Restrictions document. Specifically, but not limited to, Section 4.2 regarding aesthetic maintenance, Section 7.1 regarding property value protection, and Section 8.4 regarding community harmony and appropriate use of residential amenities." "That's a lot of sections," Henry observed. "This is a very serious violation," Hutchins continued. "The board is prepared to offer you a choice. Either you restore the pool to its original condition, white interior, as per the regulations, within 48 hours, or the board will file a formal complaint with the county. You'll be subject to fines of $500 per day the violation persists, and the county may impose additional penalties. Furthermore, if this matter escalates, you could face a lien against your property." Henry gestured to the backyard. "The pool is one of the only things in this neighborhood that's worth looking at." Hutchins's face went through several colors, red, purple, a sort of mottled white. "That is not relevant to whether it violates the code." "Isn't it?" Henry asked. "Isn't the entire point of the code that the neighborhood is supposed to be beautiful, that it's supposed to be pleasant? And I'm telling you that, to me, that pool is beautiful, more beautiful than anything in Riverside Hills has been in decades. Your personal aesthetic preferences are not what determines compliance with the HOA regulations," Hutchins said coldly. "The regulations exist to protect property values and maintain community standards." "Protect property values," Henry repeated. "James, I've been here 37 years. I've seen the property values in this neighborhood climb steadily the entire time. Meanwhile, I've also seen people get fined for keeping their lawns slightly too long, get warnings for painting their shutters the wrong shade of gray, get harassed for wanting to plant native species instead of ornamental bushes. And you know what? The property values keep going up anyway, because houses in nice suburbs appreciate just fine. The perfection isn't protecting the value, it's protecting something else. It's protecting the feeling that we have everything under control. That's all it's ever been." Hutchins had taken several steps backward as Henry spoke, as if certainty itself was contagious, and he was afraid to catch it. "I'll be documenting this visit and your refusal to remedy the violation," Hutchins said finally. "You have 48 hours to restore the pool." He turned and left without waiting for Henry's response. Henry watched him go, and then he went back to his pool. He didn't feel panic. He didn't feel regret. He felt like he was watching something inevitable unfold, like he was finally seeing his life in real time instead of in the slow motion that had characterized the past 37 years. By noon, the Riverside Hills email system was overloaded with messages. The neighborhood Facebook group had split into two warring factions. Some people thought the pool was a violation and a crime. Some people, quietly, seemed to think it was something else, though they were careful not to say so too loudly. Henry's phone rang at 1 p.m. It was Margaret, who had apparently seen the Facebook group post that someone from Portland had shared in a social media thread about weird suburban HOA stories. "Dad, is that your pool?" she asked without preamble. "Yes," he said. "Why did you paint your pool a bunch of random colors?" "Because it was beautiful," Henry said. And because I suddenly realized I didn't want to spend the rest of my life apologizing for doing things that were beautiful. Margaret was quiet for a very long time. Mom would have liked it, she said finally. She always wanted to paint our bedroom that weird peacock blue you found in a magazine, and you said it was too bold for the neighborhood. I know, Henry said quietly. How much trouble are you in? Potentially a lot. They're threatening fines, liens, all of it. Will you paint it back? Henry looked out at the pool, at the way the afternoon light was making the colors glow, at the way it looked like something alive and true. No, he said, I don't think I will. By evening, the situation had escalated further. The Riverside Hills HOA board had issued an official written notice, delivered by certified mail, warning Henry of potential legal action if the violation was not remedied within 48 hours. The board had also reached out to the county zoning office, apparently hopping for official support. But something interesting happened next. The county zoning officer who reviewed the case apparently decided that a residential pool painted in multiple colors was not actually a zoning violation. It was, the officer noted in a memo, an aesthetic choice that did not violate any county codes. The pool was properly constructed. The water was properly chemically balanced. There was no safety violation. The officer's memo concluded, while the HOA may have aesthetic preferences regarding the appearance of pools, the county does not regulate color preferences, only structural and safety standards. This matter appears to be an intra-neighborhood dispute rather than a county-level code violation. Patricia Chen called Henry shortly after receiving the county's memo. Henry, you've put the board in a very difficult position, she said, and her voice was tight with a kind of controlled fury that suggested she'd practiced this speech. How so? Henry asked. You're a former HOA president. You know better than anyone that HOAs exist to maintain standards. When a resident violates those standards, especially flagrantly, especially publicly, and the board doesn't follow up, we look weak. The entire system depends on everyone accepting that these rules exist for a reason. Do they? Henry asked. Exist for a reason, I mean, the rules. Or do they just exist because someone wrote them down 40 years ago and nobody ever had the courage to ask if they still made sense? That's not relevant, Patricia said. Rules are rules. Property owners signed the covenant when they bought their homes. You signed it. You agreed to this. I agreed to it when I was 43 years old and I thought perfection was the same thing as happiness, Henry said quietly. I don't agree anymore, and I'm asking you to really think about why you care so much. Is it about property values? The county already confirmed those are fine. Is it about neighborhood cohesion? I'd argue that a neighborhood where everyone's afraid to do anything interesting isn't cohesive. It's just quiet. He hung up after that. He didn't wait for Patricia to respond. That night, Henry sat in his backyard in a chair that faced the pool, and he watched the way the colors looked in the moonlight. The blues went deep and mysterious. The reds turned to burgundy. The gold seemed almost to glow. It was the most beautiful thing he'd ever owned. He was also probably going to lose everything over it. By the next morning, the situation had become something neither Henry nor the HOA board had anticipated. The pool had gone viral, not within Riverside Hills, but on social media. Someone from the neighborhood had posted a video on TikTok with the caption, "My neighbor is 74 and just told the HOA to shove it." And the video had been viewed 473,000 times. The comments were overwhelmingly supportive. People were sharing stories of their own HOA violations, their own dreams that had been deemed inappropriate, their own small rebellions that had been shut down. Somewhere on the internet, Henry Kavanaugh had become a symbol of something: resistance, freedom, authenticity. He wasn't sure how he felt about it. Margaret called him at 8 a.m. Dad, have you seen the news? What news? You're on Reddit, you're on Twitter. You're in articles about how ridiculous HOAs can be. People are calling you a hero. That's uncomfortable, Henry said. Lean into the discomfort, Margaret said. Because people like you matter. People who break the stupid rules that nobody should be following anyway. People who are brave enough to be weird. That matters. The HOA board called an emergency meeting. The meeting was scheduled for that evening, and Patricia sent Henry a certified letter inviting him to attend. He was allowed to bring representation. The board was going to vote on how to proceed with his violation. Henry didn't bring a lawyer. He showed up alone, in the same gray t-shirt he'd worn to paint the pool, now washed but still bearing faint stains of color. There was something powerful about that, he thought, showing up with the evidence of his rebellion still on his clothes. The meeting was held in the HOA clubhouse, a small building that had been designed with such aggressive neutrality that it seemed to exist in a state of permanent apology for taking up space. Approximately 40 residents had shown up, which was unusual. Normally, HOA meetings were sparsely attended. Patricia called the meeting to order. She went through several procedural matters before getting to the main event. Then she addressed Henry directly. Mr. Kavanaugh, as you know, you violated multiple sections of the Riverside Hills Covenant, codes, and restrictions. The board has attempted to work with you to remedy this violation. You have refused. The board is now considering escalation. Before we vote, we'd like to hear your statement. Henry stood up. He was nervous. He realized it in that moment. For all his conviction about the pool, he still felt the weight of social judgment in this room. These were his neighbors. These were people he'd lived alongside for decades. I moved to Riverside Hills because I wanted to be part of a community, he began. And for a long time, I believed that being part of a community meant following the rules, maintaining the standards, keeping things perfect. I even became good at it. I was the one enforcing the rules for 17 years. And somewhere along the way, I realized that I'd confused perfection with safety. I thought that if we just kept everything controlled enough, if we just followed the rules well enough, then we would all be happy. Then we would all be fulfilled. Then we would all have the lives we wanted. He paused, looking at the faces before him. But then I realized that following all the rules, keeping everything perfect, maintaining all the standards, it doesn't make us happy. It makes us safe in a very particular way. It keeps us from embarrassing ourselves. It keeps us from failing. It keeps us from doing the things that terrify us because they might not work out exactly right. And in keeping us safe from all of that, it also keeps us from ever really trying. It keeps us from ever really living. Someone coughed. Patricia was making notes on a legal pad, her expression neutral. I painted my pool because I wanted to do something that wasn't calculated to impress anyone or maintain a standard or contribute to an aesthetic plan. I did it because it felt true to me, and I'm not sorry for it. The county confirmed there's no structural or safety violation. The only violation is that I made a choice that isn't consistent with neighborhood preferences. And I'm saying, out loud to all of you, that I think neighborhood preferences matter less than the freedom to make choices about your own property. He sat back down. There was a long silence. Then James Hutchins spoke. I move that we escalate this matter to legal proceedings and seek a lien against the property until the violation is remedied. Patricia called for a second. Alina Rothschild, whose grass had been measured at 3.2 inches, seconded the motion. Then something unexpected happened. Marcus Rothschild, who had been sitting silently next to his wife, raised his hand. I'd like to propose an amendment, he said. His voice was quiet but surprisingly strong. I'd like to propose that the board review its entire aesthetic code with an eye toward whether these standards are actually serving the community or just protecting a particular idea of what the community should be. Because I've spent 4 years in this neighborhood being subtly made to feel like my lawn isn't green enough, my landscaping isn't formal enough, my presence isn't appropriate enough. And I look at what Henry did, and I see a man making a choice about his own space, and I see him being threatened with legal action for it. That doesn't seem right to me. There was a pause. Then another resident, Rachel Hammond, spoke up. I agree, she said. I have 3 kids. They're not allowed to paint pictures on our fence even though nobody can see it from the street. They're not allowed to have a playset that doesn't match our landscaping scheme. And I think that's insane. I think we're raising children who believe that conformity is more important than joy. I support Henry's pool. More residents spoke. Some agreed, some disagreed, but the conversation had shifted. The pool was no longer about one man's violation. It was about whether the rules that governed them all still made sense. In the end, the vote was tied, which meant that, according to the HOA bylaws, the matter would be deferred to a neighborhood-wide referendum. Every resident would get to vote on whether the aesthetic violation should stand or be remedied. The referendum would take place in 2 weeks. As Henry left the meeting, Alina Rothschild caught his arm. What you said about following the rules and losing yourself, that resonated, she said quietly. My husband and I moved here to have a quiet life after many years of fighting for everything. We wanted safety, but we've also lost something. And I think maybe we need to remember that safety without freedom is just another kind of prison. Henry nodded, unable to speak. The next 2 weeks transformed Riverside Hills in ways nobody had anticipated. The referendum, which should have been a simple yes or no vote about the colored pool, became a referendum about the entire nature of the community. Residents began discussing things that hadn't been discussed in years, maybe decades. A Facebook group called Riverside Reimagined popped up, where residents started sharing stories about HOA violations that had caused them genuine pain. There was the family with the autistic child who wanted to paint a mural in his room visible from the window, but the HOA said the colors violated aesthetic standards. There was the woman who wanted to plant a native pollinator garden instead of the approved ornamental landscaping, but was warned it would impact community standards. There was the family who had wanted to add solar panels to their roof, but the HOA deemed them architecturally inconsistent. And running counter to this, the Riverside Heritage Group formed, arguing that the aesthetic standards were what had made the neighborhood valuable in the first place. Their argument was reasonable in its way. Property values had indeed remained consistently high. People did choose to buy homes in Riverside Hills specifically because of the maintained appearance. If they stripped away the standards, weren't they removing the very thing that attracted new residents? Henry watched the debate unfold from his backyard where he was sitting beside his pool. The colors had begun to fade slightly in the afternoon sun. The paint wasn't designed for permanent outdoor exposure, but if anything, that made it more beautiful. The pigments were becoming more subtle, more layered, more real. Margaret came to visit him for a week. She took a flight from Portland on a Thursday, and when she arrived at the house, the first thing she did was walk to the backyard and stand looking at the pool for a very long time without speaking. "It's bigger than it looked in the photos," she said finally. "It looks like something alive," Henry said. "That's because you painted it with passion instead of paint-by-numbers' rules." They sat together for hours that day, barely talking, just being in the presence of the thing Henry had made. That evening, Margaret asked him the question that he suspected she'd been building up to. "Are you dying, Dad?" Henry turned to look at his daughter. She was 46 years old, which made him acutely aware that he'd been 74 for an entire year without really noticing the significance. 74 years old. If he'd had an average lifespan, he was probably already in the endgame. "Not that I know of," he said. "The doctor says I'm in decent health, high blood pressure which apparently comes from stress, but no terminal diagnosis or anything." "Then why is it like you suddenly started living this year?" Margaret asked. "Your pool, the HOA thing, calling me back and talking about real things instead of surface-level updates. It's like someone flipped a switch." Henry considered the question. "I think I realized I was already dying," he said finally. "I was dying slowly in a house full of things I'd chosen correctly but not genuinely, and I woke up one day and thought, if I'm going to die anyway, I want to have lived first." Margaret nodded slowly, like this made sense to her. "I'm worried about you," she said. "I know. Are you prepared for what's going to happen if you lose the referendum? The board might actually pursue legal action." "I'm prepared for that," Henry said. "Losing the referendum won't change my mind about the pool." That night, Margaret made dinner, her mother's recipe for pasta with brown butter and sage, something Henry hadn't eaten in 5 years because he'd gotten too comfortable with his precise nutritional calculations. The taste of it was almost overwhelming. It connected him to years he hadn't fully lived in, moments with his wife when they'd still surprised each other. The next morning, Margaret went with Henry to his therapist's office. Dr. Lisa Chen was a woman in her 60s who specialized in late-life transitions and existential anxiety. Henry had been seeing her for 3 months, trying to understand why perfect life had felt so empty. "Margaret, I'm glad you're here," Dr. Chen said. "Henry's been working through some significant questions about identity and authentic living. What are your observations from the outside?" Margaret glanced at Henry, then at the therapist. "I think my father spent so long being who he thought he was supposed to be that he forgot there was an alternative, and I think the pool is him remembering." "Tell me more," Dr. Chen said. "My mother was creative. She loved color and spontaneity. My father was stable and organized. They loved each other, but they also, I think, made each other a little smaller. My mom compromised on color. My dad compromised on adventure, and they built a life together that was good but also kind of beige. Henry felt something crack inside his chest when she said that. Beige, that was exactly right. And now, Dr. Chen asked. Now my father's painting his pool in the middle of a suburban neighborhood that would give an HOA violation for a splash of color, Margaret said. And I think he's finally becoming the person he actually was underneath all the rules. That afternoon, Alina and Marcus Rothschild came by. They brought a housewarming gift, a painting by Alina, actually something she'd created herself. It was abstract, with layers of color bleeding into each other, and it was extraordinary. I haven't painted in 12 years, Alina said, setting it on Henry's living room wall. I used to paint all the time before we moved here. I stopped because it felt like a violation of the neighborhood aesthetic somehow. Bringing color inside, it seemed wrong. But watching you paint your pool, seeing you refuse to apologize for it, it made me remember that I used to have dreams that weren't about being appropriate. Marcus nodded. I've been speaking with several residents about starting a community art initiative, something that would introduce more color into the neighborhood, more creativity. It's not about destroying Riverside Hills. It's about allowing it to have texture, personality, depth, like every other real place in the world. Over the next week, more residents began making quiet moves. The Hendersons announced that they were planning to replace their ornamental bushes with a native plant garden. The Patels asked about the process for getting an exception to the pool code so they could paint a small mural in their children's play area. Rachel Hammond started a homeschool art project where the kids were creating a collaborative outdoor sculpture garden. The HOA board, unsure how to respond to this wave of unofficial rebellion, decided to move up the referendum vote to 10 days away rather than waiting the full 2 weeks. Their hopping people will have forgotten about it, Patricia Chen told Henry when she called. Her voice was strained. She sounded like a woman trying to hold together something that was coming apart. But I'm telling you now, Henry, we could reach a compromise, paint half the pool, paint it just in the deep end, which is less visible from the street. Just give us something that lets us say we've maintained standards. No, Henry said. Henry, don't do this. Don't force us to pursue legal action. It's going to end badly. For whom? Henry asked. For you. I accept that. For the neighborhood, I think it might be the best thing that's happened to Riverside Hills in 40 years. There was silence on the line. Then Patricia hung up without saying goodbye. The referendum was held on a Saturday morning. It took place in the HOA clubhouse, and this time the attendance was off the charts. Nearly 80% of the neighborhood showed up, either to vote in person or to drop off absentee ballots. Henry walked to the clubhouse with Margaret. As they approached the building, he was surprised to find people lining the pathway. At first, he thought they were there to jeer at him, but then he realized they were smiling. Alina and Marcus were there. The Patels, the Hendersons, Rachel Hammond and her 3 kids, even some people Henry didn't know very well, people he'd lived next to for years but never really talked to. A man named Gerald from 2 streets over caught Henry's arm as he passed. Thank you, Gerald said simply, for reminding me that I'm allowed to live my own life. Inside the clubhouse, they cast their votes in privacy as the law required. But as the votes were counted, something interesting happened. Nobody tried to hide their choices. People came up to Henry and said, voted for your pool, or I couldn't live with myself voting against you. There was an honesty and visibility to the process that felt important. The final vote count was 92% in favor of allowing the pool to remain as is. Patricia announced the results without any preamble, her jaw tight, her eyes fixed on the podium in front of her. The neighborhood has voted, she said, her voice clipped. By overwhelming margin, they have chosen to allow the aesthetic violation to stand. As HOA president, I am obligated to abide by the decision of the membership. The matter is closed. She looked up and her eyes met Henry's for just a moment. In that moment, Henry saw something like rage and something like relief, intermingled so thoroughly he couldn't separate them. The Riverside Heritage Group made noises about appealing the decision or pursuing legal action anyway. But without the unanimous board support they'd initially imagined, the threat was hollow. James Hutchins, the compliance officer, announced that he was taking a position with a different HOA in the neighboring county. He was departing, he said, because the standards were no longer what they had been when I was hired. That evening, Henry sat in his backyard with Margaret, watching the sunset turn his colored pool into something that looked alive and breathing. He felt enormously tired. The weight of the past weeks, the decision, the violation, the argument, the vote, it had exhausted him. "You did it," Margaret said. "You actually did it." "I painted a pool," Henry said. "I don't think I did anything particularly extraordinary." "You questioned the rules," Margaret said. "You decided that your life was yours to live, not anybody else's to approve. You taught a whole neighborhood that it's possible to be different. That's pretty extraordinary, actually." That night, Henry dreamed about his wife. In the dream, they were young again in their first house before Riverside Hills, before the perfection. Susan was painting their bedroom the peacock blue that he'd once told her was too bold. He watched her work, and he realized that he'd been wrong. The color was perfect because she loved it, because it made her happy, because it was hers. When he woke up, he knew what he had to do. Over the next week, Henry did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He called a meeting with the HOA board, not to fight anymore, but to talk. Patricia arrived at his house looking like a woman who expected another battle. Instead, Henry served her tea, and they sat in his living room, surrounded by the lived-in comfort of a house that was starting to show signs of actual personality. "I owe you an apology," Henry began. Patricia's eyebrows rose. "I became HOA president because I believed in rules," he continued. "I believed that rules protected people, protected property, protected the neighborhood from chaos, and there's truth in that. Rules do those things. But I also, over the course of 17 years, became someone who enforced rules without questioning them. I issued violation notices for small infractions of the aesthetic code without really considering whether those infractions mattered. I maintained a system that, I now realize, caused real pain to people who just wanted to live their lives with a little more color, a little more authenticity." He paused. Patricia was listening, really listening, not waiting for her turn to speak. "The pool is beautiful, and I'm not going to change it," Henry said. "But I think there's a way to rebuild this community that doesn't involve me being right and you being wrong. I think there's a way to have some standards while also allowing people room to be themselves. I want to help with that if you'll let me." Patricia set down her teacup with a careful precision that suggested she was processing information that didn't quite fit her existing categories. "What are you proposing?" she asked. Over the next month, Henry and Patricia worked together with a broader committee to rewrite the Riverside Hills aesthetic code. It was harder than simply enforcing the old code. It required actual thinking, actual conversations about values, actual acknowledgement that a neighborhood could be nice-looking without being identical. They created a framework that maintained certain core standards: no broken-down cars in driveways, no trash visible from the street, no actual structural violations that affected neighbors' homes. But they also created exceptions for trees and gardens if they were well-maintained. They allowed interior decorations that were visible through windows. They added an artistic expression clause that allowed residents to apply for approval of projects that fell outside the standard aesthetic, but had cultural or personal significance. The colored pool was grandfathered in as an exception, officially approved by the board. Alina Rothschild became the head of a new community expression committee that reviewed aesthetic exception requests. Within 3 months, they'd approved 17 exceptions: a pollinator garden, a small meditation space with Buddha statues, a hand-painted mural depicting family history, a mosaic decorative fence, several painted garden gates and decorative elements. Riverside Hills didn't stop being nice-looking. The property values actually increased slightly, but it started becoming a neighborhood where people didn't feel like they were being held under constant surveillance. Children were allowed to paint pictures. Parents were allowed to make choices. Life was allowed to have color. The transformation was subtle but profound. What had been a perfect suburban neighborhood started to become an actual community. People began knowing each other. Block parties started happening. Conversations about more than property maintenance values occurred. 3 months after the referendum, Henry was invited to a neighborhood gathering. It wasn't an official HOA function. It was just people gathering to celebrate summer. There was music. There was food that people had actually cooked instead of ordering from approved caterers. There was laughter and mess, and the kinds of moments that don't make it into neighborhood marketing materials but constitute actual community. Margaret had extended her visit from Portland. She was sitting by the pool with Alina when Henry joined them. "Your father is a revolutionary," Alina was telling Margaret. "Do you know that? 1 year ago, he was enforcing the regulations that made me feel like I didn't belong here. Now he's helping create a neighborhood where I actually want to raise my children. He's learning, Margaret said. He's becoming the person he might have been if he hadn't spent so long trying to be perfect. Henry looked at them both, and he felt something shift inside him. Not satisfaction exactly, something deeper. Alignment, the feeling of being finally where he was supposed to be. But the transformation wasn't complete. There was still unfinished business. Henry called Margaret to his study one evening. "I need to talk to you about something," he said, "about your mother." Margaret sat down, looking concerned. "What about her?" "I think I let her become smaller so that I could be bigger," Henry said quietly. "I think I made choices about what was appropriate and what wasn't, and I didn't ask her input. I think I was so focused on being responsible and stable that I wasn't actually being present with her. And now she's gone, and I can't apologize for that." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "Do you know what I remember about Mom?" she said finally. "I remember her painting that peacock blue in my closet when you were at work, just one wall in a closet you couldn't see from the street, and she was so happy doing it, like she was being rebellious without actually harming anything. And I think maybe she understood what you're just now learning, that joy and appropriateness are different things, and sometimes joy is more important." Henry nodded, unable to speak. "She loved you," Margaret said, "and she understood that you were trying your best with what you knew, but I think she would have been really proud of you right now, the way you're living, the way you're being yourself." That night, Henry did something he hadn't done in the 5 years since Susan's death. He went through the boxes of her things that were stored in the attic. He found her sketchbooks, filled with drawings and paintings and color studies that she'd done before she'd become a suburban wife and mother. She'd been talented. She'd been bold. She'd been fully alive on those pages. He brought the sketchbooks downstairs and looked at them for hours, and then he called Alina Rothschild. "I'd like to do something," he said, "for the community. Would you be interested in helping me create a memorial garden for my wife? It would feature her paintings, reproductions, but large-scale, displayed outdoors, and we could make it a space where artists in the neighborhood could show their work." Alina was quiet on the other end of the line, but Henry could hear the smile in her voice. "I think," she said, "that's the most beautiful thing I've heard all year." Over the next 2 months, a small corner of the Riverside Hills common area was transformed into what Alina had started calling the Garden of Second Chances. Henry worked with Alina to enlarge and reproduce some of Susan's paintings. There was a self-portrait she'd done in 1985 when she was still becoming herself. There were landscapes from a trip to California they'd taken before children, before the house, before the rules had solidified into their final form. There were abstract explorations in color that looked like music rendered as pigment. The reproductions were displayed on large panels around the garden, but the garden itself was also a work of art. Alina had designed it to incorporate elements from the aesthetic exceptions that various neighbors had requested over the past months. There were the native plants that the Hendersons had fought for. There was a small mosaic pathway that used tiles created by Rachel Hammond's children. There was a meditation bench designed by Marcus Rothschild. There was even a small, painted mural depicting moments from neighborhood life, barbecues and children playing and gardens growing. The dedication ceremony took place on a Saturday in September. 90% of the neighborhood showed up. Patricia Chen gave a speech acknowledging Henry's contributions to the neighborhood, both in his years as HOA president and in his recent work to make Riverside Hills a place where people could actually live instead of just exist. James Hutchins, the compliance officer who'd left for another county, sent a letter to be read aloud. In it, he expressed regret for his rigid enforcement of the rules and acknowledgement that Henry Kavanaugh's courageous choice to question the status quo has reminded me that compliance and community are not the same thing. Margaret stood next to her father at the dedication, and when the crowd dispersed to admire the garden, she squeezed his hand. "Susan would have loved this," Margaret said. "I think she was waiting for me to understand something," Henry replied. "That love isn't about maintaining standards. It's about making space for the people you care about to become fully themselves." That evening, Alina hosted a dinner at her house. It was an informal gathering of about 20 people, neighbors who had, over the course of the past months, become actual friends. They weren't people who'd known each other for years and maintained polite distance. They were people who'd actually seen each other, actually spoken to each other about real things. Gerald, the man from 2 streets over, brought wine. The Patels brought homemade samosas. Rachel Hammond's kids had made desserts, some of which were lopsided and imperfect and absolutely delicious. The meal was chaotic and joyful, and absolutely nothing like the carefully orchestrated neighborhood gatherings that Henry had attended for decades. Sitting in Aliner's dining room, looking at the faces of people he'd lived next to for years, but was only now actually getting to know, Henry felt a kind of peace that had nothing to do with perfection and everything to do with presence. After dinner, Aliner led the group outside, where she'd arranged string lights and outdoor seating around her garden. She brought out a projector and screen. "I've compiled some photos of the neighborhood over the years," she said. "I want to show what it looks like now compared to before the colored pool, because the difference is visible even if it's not what we expected." She clicked through photos. There were before photos, the neighborhood in its original pristine perfection. Perfect lawns, perfect shutters, perfect emptiness. And then there were after photos, the colored pool gleaming in sunlight, Aliner's pollinator garden creating a riot of flowers and visiting bees, the Hendersons' native plants looking wild and alive, the painted gates and decorated patios, and subtly, unmistakably, there were people in these photos. Neighbors actually outside their homes, talking to each other, playing with their children, creating rather than just maintaining. "What I notice," Aliner said, "is that Riverside Hills is still beautiful, but it's beautiful in a different way. It's beautiful because it has character now. And character only comes from people being allowed to be themselves." As she showed the photos, Henry felt something shift in the room's understanding. Nobody was arguing that the colored pool had been wrong, but everyone was also realizing that the beautiful thing wasn't the pool itself. The beautiful thing was what the pool had allowed: permission. Permission to be different. Permission to create. Permission to be alive. The weekend after the dedication, Henry received a call from the county zoning office. The officer who had initially ruled that the pool was not a zoning violation was calling to let him know that he was retiring. But before he left, he wanted to speak with Henry about a new pilot program the county was developing to encourage residential communities to create character standards rather than pure aesthetic standards. "Your neighborhood is actually becoming a model," the officer said. "You've maintained property values while also allowing community expression. We're thinking about adapting that model for other HOA communities in the county. Would you be willing to serve as a consultant?" Henry agreed, though he felt slightly strange about it. A few months ago, he'd been rebelling against the HOA system. Now he was going to help reform it from the inside. The irony was not lost on him. Over the next several weeks, Henry worked with the county to develop a framework for what they were calling expressive standards. The idea was that HOAs could maintain baseline standards that protected property values and neighborhood safety, while also creating frameworks that allowed individual expression within those guidelines. The Riverside Hills model became increasingly well known. A journalist from the regional newspaper came to do a story. The article was headlined, "The Colored Pool That Saved a Neighborhood," and it featured interviews with Henry, Aliner, and several residents talking about how the neighborhood had become more vibrant and real over the past months. But not everyone was happy about it. There was a particularly fierce response from the Riverside Heritage group, which had by now become a small but vocal minority, arguing that the neighborhood had been degraded by allowing too much personal expression. A man named Robert Hendricks, who lived on the opposite side of the neighborhood, and whom Henry barely knew, wrote a letter to the HOA board arguing that the colored pool and the subsequent exceptions represented a slippery slope toward suburban decay. "What started as one colorful pool," Hendricks wrote, "will inevitably lead to a neighborhood full of eyesores, declining property values, and the loss of the very standards that made Riverside Hills a desirable place to live. I strongly urge the board to reverse its permissive policies and return to the enforcement standards of the pre-pool era." Patricia Chen brought the letter to Henry. "He's not entirely wrong," Patricia said quietly. "We have taken a risk. There's a possibility that allowing more personal expression could eventually lead to neighborhood decline. It's happened in other communities." "What do you want to do?" Henry asked. "I want to hear what you think," Patricia said. "You're the person who started all this." Henry considered the question carefully. He thought about perfection and authenticity and whether a neighborhood could have both. He thought about his wife's paintings, about Aliner's garden, about the children's mosaic tiles. He thought about the cost of enforcing rules that didn't matter and the possibility of chaos if there were no rules at all. "I think we need to be intentional," he said finally. "We need to monitor what happens. If we start seeing actual decay, homes not being maintained, property values actually declining, that kind of thing, then we adjust. But I think we also need to trust that people are generally good, that when you give people permission to be themselves, they don't automatically become worse versions of themselves. They often become better versions." Patricia nodded. "That's what I believe too. I just wanted to hear you say it." The neighborhood continued to evolve over the following months. There were no new eyesores. Homeowners remained invested in their properties. In fact, something interesting happened. Property values actually increased more in Riverside Hills than they did in comparable neighborhoods because people started actively choosing to live there. Not just because the houses were nice or the prices were reasonable, but because the neighborhood had personality and community. The crime rate went down. Civic participation went up. People actually knew their neighbors. Not everything was perfect. There were still minor conflicts. Someone planted a landscape feature that their neighbors thought was too ostentatious. Someone else's extension to the back patio exceeded the shadow line that would affect the neighbor's solar panels. But these conflicts were now handled through conversation rather than violation notices. People talked to each other. People tried to understand each other's perspectives. It was messier than the old system. It required more emotional labor. But it was also alive in a way that Riverside Hills had never been before. 6 months after the colored pool, Henry stood in his backyard one evening, now very early evening because it was January again and the days were short, and looked at his creation. The paint had faded considerably. The colors that had been so vivid in August were now subtle, layered, showing the wear of a full season of weather. The blues had softened to grays. The reds had mellowed to russet. The golds had become almost abstract. He was 75 years old now. He'd moved past the age at which Susan had still been alive. Every day forward would be living in time that she'd never seen. Margaret was on speakerphone, calling from Portland with a video call request. "Show me the pool," she said when they connected. "Let me see what 6 months of weather does to rebellion." Henry carried his phone outside and showed her the pool in the golden light of late afternoon. The colors were indeed transformed, but not diminished. If anything, they were more beautiful. They looked like they'd been painted by time itself, weathered into authenticity. "It looks like a life," Margaret said, "like something real instead of something perfect." "I've been thinking about that," Henry said. "About the difference. I spent so long trying to make my life look right that I never actually lived it. And now that I'm actually living it, the living is showing. The pool fades, the paint chips, things decay. But that decay is evidence that something real happened here." "That's very philosophical for a man who used to schedule his coffee to the exact minute," Margaret teased. "I still schedule my coffee," Henry said, "but not as strictly, and I sometimes change the schedule because something unexpected comes up that's more important than the schedule." Over the course of the winter, Henry continued his work with the county on the expressive standards framework. He gave talks to other HOA communities about balancing aesthetic maintenance with personal freedom. He consulted with boards trying to figure out how to transform their own neighborhoods. And he also did something he'd been meaning to do for a long time. He started painting. He was not good at it. His paintings were technically competent, but not inspired. He had a clear understanding of composition from his years of looking at neighborhood architecture, and his colors were generally harmonious because he'd spent decades thinking about how colors worked in residential settings. But what his paintings lacked in brilliance, they made up for in joy. He painted things because they interested him, not because they were appropriate. He painted his wife from her photographs. He painted his neighborhood as it had been and as it had become. He painted Aliner's garden. He painted the colored pool in all its weathered complexity. Aliner displayed some of them in her art studio, which she'd opened formally in the community center. Visitors were often surprised to learn that Henry Kavanaugh, the man who'd been the strict HOA president, had created them. The transformation seemed impossible to them, that the same person who'd measured grass to 3.2 inches was now making art. "But it's not that much of a transformation," Henry explained when people expressed surprise. "I was always the same person. I was just operating under the assumption that my natural self, my authentic self, wasn't acceptable. The pool didn't change me, it just let me acknowledge who I already was." One evening in March, Aliner hosted another dinner. Many of the same people came, but also some new people, residents who'd moved to Riverside Hills in the months after its reputation for being a creative and welcoming community had spread. The neighborhood had started attracting young families and artists and people who wanted to live in a place with both standards and soul. The dinner was held outdoors in Aliner's garden, where early spring was making the world green again. They ate and talked and laughed. Robert Hendricks, the man who'd written the letter about suburban decay, had moved away. His house had been bought by a young couple with 2 children who immediately added bright blue shutters to their exterior and planted a wildflower garden. The decay that Hendricks had feared had not come. Instead, what had come was authenticity. After dinner, as the sun was setting, Patricia Chen pulled Henry aside. "I wanted to tell you something," she said. "I've decided to step down as HOA president. I've had 6 incredible months, but I think the board is ready for someone with a different vision." Aliner's been asked if she'd take on the role, and she's accepted. Henry felt something unexpected at this news, a kind of peace. The work of transformation was being passed to the next generation. The change was no longer about him. It was about the neighborhood, about people continuing to question and reimagine what was possible. "Aliner will be wonderful," Henry said. "You could take the role back, you know," Patricia said. "You started all this. A lot of people think you're the rightful leader of the community's transformation." Henry shook his head. "I started something, yes, but I started it by breaking a rule, not by leading from authority. I think the neighborhood is ready now to be led by someone whose first instinct is creation rather than enforcement. Aliner creates. I'm just learning to." That night, after everyone had left, Henry sat in his living room and looked at one of his paintings, a landscape of his neighborhood as it had been. Perfect, empty, soulless. He thought about storing it away, but instead, he hung it on his wall right next to Aliner's painting of the same view, but reimagined with color and life and possibility. He called Margaret. "I want to know something," he said. "In your memory, what was Mom's favorite color?" Margaret laughed. "Peacock blue. She always wanted to paint something peacock blue, and you wouldn't let her. Why?" "Because I'm thinking about painting my front door that color," Henry said. "Just that one door. Breaking one more rule in a small way in a place that will affect just me." "Do it," Margaret said immediately, "and send me a photo when you do." The next Saturday, Henry bought a tin of peacock blue paint. He carefully painted his front door. The color was exactly the shade his wife had loved, deep and rich and impossibly bold for a suburban neighborhood. Against the Benjamin Moore Ashwood Pearl exterior walls, it was shocking. It was beautiful. It was absolutely him. It was also technically an aesthetic violation. But when James Hutchins's replacement came to assess it, she took one look at the door, then looked at Henry and smiled. "You know," she said, "I think there might be an exception clause that covers this, for doors that represent a personal expression of neighborhood character." Henry knew there wasn't, but he also knew that sometimes the most important function of a rule is to know when to break it. He didn't ask the officer to check. He simply thanked her and invited her in for coffee. By summer of the following year, the neighborhood had fully transformed. It was still undeniably Riverside Hills. The basic structure of subdivision remained intact. The houses were well maintained. The property values had remained stable and strong. But there was color now. There was life. Henry had turned 76, and he'd lived more fully in this past year than he had in the previous 37 combined. He went to breakfast without scheduling it first. He took walks without timing them. He created art even though he wasn't particularly good at it. He had friendships that weren't organized by proximity and property value, but by genuine affection. Aliner and Marcus invited him on a trip to Costa Rica to see the painted villages. Margaret came too. For 2 weeks, they traveled and looked at places where color and community had been woven together for centuries, where beauty and authenticity were understood to be the same thing. When they returned, Henry found his house exactly as he'd left it, but also completely transformed in his mind. He looked at it, the peacock blue door, the colored pool, now only faintly visible, the paint nearly weathered away to white again, the simple suburban architecture, and he saw it as it actually was. Not perfect, but real. Not impressive, but beloved. He thought about dying. He was 76. He'd had a full life by any standard. If he died tomorrow, he would leave behind a neighborhood that was more authentic than when he'd found it. He would leave behind paintings that his daughter could keep. He would leave behind Aliner's garden, which would outlive him by decades. He would leave behind the evidence that a single person acting with intention and courage could change a place. But he also thought about living, about the possibility that he might have another decade ahead of him, or even more, about all the paintings he still wanted to create, all the conversations he still wanted to have, all the ways he still wanted to surprise himself. One evening in early autumn, 1 year after the pool, Henry stood in his backyard and looked at what he'd created. The paint was nearly gone now, weathered back to white. The colored pool was, to most observers, simply a normal pool again. But Henry could see it clearly, the ghost of the color beneath the weathering. He could see all the blue that had been there, all the red, all the gold. He could see the moment when he decided to live his own life, and he could see the ripple of that decision, spreading outward through the neighborhood, changing things in ways that were both visible and invisible. Eleanor came by, as she often did, carrying fresh flowers for his garden. She was wearing paint-stained clothes because she'd been working in her studio all day. She looked radiantly alive. "I was thinking," Eleanor said, "about repainting your pool. What do you think? Maybe freshen up the colors, but stay true to the original design." Henry looked at her, then at his pool, then back at Eleanor. "I think," he said slowly, "that I like the faded version. I like that it shows what was there, but also shows what time has done to it. I like that it's a record of an action, not just the action itself." Eleanor smiled. "That's the most poet thing I've ever heard you say." "I contain multitudes," Henry said. As the sun set over Riverside Hills, painting the sky in genuine colors that no HOA could ever regulate, Henry realized that perfection had never been the point. The point was life. The point was being alive. The point was having the courage to be fully yourself, even when being fully yourself meant defying the expectations of people you'd lived next to for decades. The colored pool would fade completely. One day, there would be no visible evidence that he'd ever poured buckets of color into the water. Someone else would own the house. The neighborhood would continue to evolve, taking him and his rebellion and making it part of its history. But that was fine. The real pool, the true pool, was not the one he'd painted. The real pool was the awakening. It was Eleanor starting to paint again. It was the Hendersons planting native plants. It was children being allowed to create. It was a community learning to be itself instead of maintaining the image of itself. That pool would never fade. And as Henry stood in his backyard, watching the colors drain from the sky, he felt the gentle stirring of contentment. Not satisfaction. That was too passive a word. But the active, engaged peace of a man who had finally, at 76 years old, decided to be fully alive. He picked up his paintbrush. He had a new painting to start. It was going to be large and bold and probably not very good. It was going to be exactly what he wanted to create, regardless of whether anyone else thought it was appropriate. It was going to be beautiful. The parking lot outside the regional HOA conference center was full of vehicles bearing stickers from communities across the state. Henry was 60 attending what had become the most popular conference on community standards and personal expression in the region. He was one of 3 keynote speakers. His presentation was titled "The Colored Pool: How One Small Act of Rebellion Changed Everything." He showed slides of the neighborhood before and after. He explained the framework that had been developed to balance community standards with personal authenticity. He told the story, though he left out some of the more difficult details: the fear, the sleepless nights, the possibility of losing everything. After his presentation, he signed books. Yes, books. Eleanor had convinced him to write a memoir, and it had sold surprisingly well, especially among people who'd grown up in suburban neighborhoods and felt like they'd lost themselves somewhere between birth and mortgages. Margaret sat in the audience, beaming. She'd moved to be closer to her father 2 years ago, leaving Portland to help him manage his art projects and his consulting work. They had lunch together every Saturday. They painted together sometimes, though Margaret was considerably better at it than he was. That evening, Henry went to dinner with Eleanor, Marcus, Patricia, and several residents from Riverside Hills who'd come to the conference. They celebrated what the neighborhood had become, and they also discussed the challenges they still faced. Property taxes were increasing. Some of the newer residents didn't understand the history of why the rules had changed. There were new conflicts to navigate. But the neighborhood was alive, it was real, and it would continue to evolve as all real things do. As Henry walked back to his hotel, he thought about his wife. He thought about all the peacock blue walls she'd never been allowed to paint, all the bold choices she'd never been permitted to make. He thought about the painting of hers that hung in a Leaner's gallery, a large abstract in colors that would never have been approved by the old HOA. She was dead, and he couldn't change that. But he'd changed something else. He'd changed the place she'd lived. He'd made it a place where the next generation of wives and daughters and neighbors could be themselves without the weight of perfect conformity. It wasn't an apology. Apologies were for things you'd done wrong. This was different. This was redemption. This was the act of making the world slightly better because you'd learned what you'd done wrong and you'd had the courage to change. His phone buzzed with a message from a Leaner. The new community center mural project has been approved. Your pool isn't the only colored thing in Riverside Hills anymore. Henry smiled and sent back a thumbs-up emoji. He'd learned to use emojis, another small rebellion against his former self who'd thought they were undignified, another small choice to be alive rather than appropriate. As he settled into his hotel room, he looked at the painting he'd brought with him, the watercolor of his neighborhood, done 3 years ago, showing the pool in all its vibrant color. He'd painted it from memory, trying to capture that moment when he'd decided to break the rules, to live his life on his own terms. It looked less like his neighborhood than like a promise that perfection was less important than being alive, that rules existed to serve people, not the other way around, that a single person acting with intention could change everything. Henry was 79 years old. He didn't know how many years he had left, but he knew he'd use them well. He knew he'd spend them creating and connecting and challenging. He knew he'd never go back to the careful precision of his earlier life, the scheduled coffee and measured grass and appropriately muted colors. He'd tasted color, and there was no going back to gray. He'd tasted life, and there was no going back to merely existing. The old man who'd poured buckets of color into his pool had painted his life in the same bold, bright hues, and he'd taught everyone watching that it was never too late to become yourself.